What events in your own history led you to become a behavior analyst?
Well, that's pretty easy to answer. In the fall of 1954, I was a sophomore at Columbia College in New York, and I had started out as a math major. I was wondering about what I'd be doing next, and I walked into a class. I took the introductory psych course there at the time, Psych 1-2, and the person who was teaching it was Fred Keller. And the fall semester was a lab course with rats in it, and the spring semester was human experiments, and that sort of did it. I had a lab partner whose name was Richard Berger. He went on and did some other stuff. Eventually, I think he had some position at Columbia involved with students and so on. But anyway, I went from Keller's course into Nat Schoenfeld's experimental psych course, and that would have been my junior year. And in the fall, we used Woodworth's 1938 edition of Experimental Psychology as our textbooks, and we did as our experiments what would essentially today be called a course in psychophysics. We did visual, dark adaptation, thresholds, and things of that sort. In the spring, we had a rat lab. Elliot Hurst was the teaching assistant, and the textbooks for the spring semester were Hull's Principles and Skinner's Behavior of Organisms. It was a relatively small class, about a dozen or so students, and I've actually written about this in a paper about Nat Schoenfeld for the Behavior Analyst, but I was living at home with my parents when I was an undergraduate, and my father would drop me off early on campus, and I'd end up in the classroom for the experimental course early, and Nat Schoenfeld tended to show up early, and we'd be talking for half an hour before the other students turned up. I was incredibly lucky because Elliot Hurst went to St. Elizabeth's Hospital after that, what was it, 1955-1956 semester, and Nat Schoenfeld needed a teaching assistant for what would be my senior year, and apparently in the incoming group of graduate assistants and the ones who were around already, they either had other commitments or they weren't people who were familiar with what Nat wanted to do in the experimental course. And since I had just taken it, Elliot came to me one day and said, Nat Schoenfeld would like to see if you'd like to be a teaching assistant. So I was a teaching assistant my senior year, and Nat really had a tremendous effect in that he would take me in the lab, show me how to do calibration of dark adaptation apparatus. We would independently grade the students' papers. And I was curious because a couple of those students were also students with whom I was taking other courses in my senior year. In my senior year, I did a course with Fred Keller, which was a course on teaching, in which I taught my brother, who was at that time, was about 49, who was about 7 or 8 years old, to do algebra. And I also was taking a course in which Keller and Schoenfeld and Ralph Hefferline together taught a seminar on verbal behavior. And we read the William James lectures in the beginning of the course. This would have been the spring of 1957. Halfway through the course, the book Verbal Behavior appeared, Skinner's Verbal Behavior, and we spent the rest of the course doing that. How could one be any more lucky than to have walked into that kind of timing? And that doesn't even get me on to graduate school.
Well, I was just going to ask you, because the next question is, how were you trained as a behavior analyst? So you've told the first part of your training, and so maybe you could continue.
Well, I stayed on for a master's at Columbia, and I was sort of thinking of going on, and because it was kind of seemed a natural sort of thing for me to stay at Columbia, to work with Schoenfeld, who was working on the T-Tau stuff. But by that time, having been an undergraduate there and having taken courses with a lot of the faculty members, I was beginning to wonder whether I wasn't getting the same kinds of things. But I was reluctant because I sort of thought, well, they've invested time in me. I've learned how they like things to work in the undergraduate lab, and I'm a teaching assistant now. And also, another incidental factor, totally irrelevant to behavior analysis, is that Nat Schoenfeld liked to play chess. And I was a chess player, but just an ordinary kind of chess player. And in the psych department, there were 4 graduate students: Elliot Hurst, Francis Mechner, Stuart Margolis, and Al Weissman. Al Weissman went on into psychopharmacology. Anyway, they were all chess masters. And if any of us played them, they would just wipe us off the board. The best game I ever played was a game I played with Elliot Hurst, in which I played him to a draw, but he had spotted me a queen. So, but I could play that. And so once I was a teaching assistant, we used to play chess at lunchtime, and then we'd walk across Amsterdam Avenue where there was a delicatessen, or rather, first we'd walk over to across Amsterdam Avenue to a delicatessen. We'd typically bring back a pastrami sandwich, and we'd sit down together, and we'd have a game of chess, and we'd talk. And we were walking across, and very reluctantly, I said, you know, Nat, I've been taking, and by the way, I was calling him Nat by then. I hadn't called Fred Keller Fred, and although I think that would have been okay, but I said, I've taken a lot of courses here, and I just sort of wondered whether, should I consider maybe that I'd be better off learning more by going some other place. We got our sandwiches. He walked me to Fred Keller's office. He talked to him for a minute. The next thing I knew, Fred Keller was on the phone with somebody, and it turned out that he was talking to Fred Skinner, and said, we've got a student here for you. And so that, a little bit later, I went up there to meet Skinner, and I also applied for a fellowship and got what was then an NSF fellowship and support. So that began the next part of my history. So that was just, again, I was just lucky to have things work out. Especially because in those days, the undergraduate curriculum was really geared up at Columbia. It was especially geared for the undergraduates, and the graduate students sort of all worked toward that end. Harvard was not geared up for the undergraduates at all. If you were a Harvard undergraduate, there were undergraduate psych courses, but the bulk of psychology at Harvard then was social relations, which had clinical psych and sociology and all the other things, and the psych department was just strictly experimental. So it was primarily an experimental graduate program, and everything was geared to work for the graduate students. And when I arrived, Skinner was at one end of Memorial Hall, and Smitty Stevens was at the other end. George Miller, who had been on sabbatical, had decided to leave the department to start the Cognitive Center with Jerry Bruner. Phil Teitelbaum had left as their person in physiological, so essentially the two ends of the lab. Lou Golub was the person who took us under his wing and taught us programming. And we were the biggest class to date in the department at that time. And so my classmates were Harlan Lane and George Reynolds and Herb Terrace and several other people. In that, let's see, so that would have been 1958. And in the 58-59 academic year, a guy named Noam Chomsky came over from MIT one day and gave a colloquium which Skinner attended. He talked about transformational grammar and some other linguistic stuff. Never mentioned that there was this book review that was going to come out any time now. And so there I had been. I had taken the verbal behavior seminar with Keller and Schoenfeld and Hefferline, and then was there when the Chomsky stuff broke. So again, that was part of it. But essentially, Skinner was stepping down from the Pigeon Lab. We thought it was really special if we were walking down the hall and we actually had a chance to talk to him. So what we did, we were a very competitive bunch, and so we were doing our research and essentially arguing with each other a lot. Dale Brethauer was there also, and then we sort of were all competing as to who would finish first. Actually, George Reynolds beat me out, and so did Harlan. But anyway, the timing worked out beautifully again because Lou Golub got a job offer from the University of Maryland at College Park, and that meant the Pigeon Lab was available. And George Reynolds had already accepted a position as a lecturer and hadn't yet gotten his offer from Chicago. And so I ended up being asked to run the Pigeon Lab. And being asked to run the Pigeon Lab in those days was, well, Fred Skinner was going off giving a colloquium here and a talk there, and he really just had a couple of little things he was interested in. Essentially, we got the lab, and George Reynolds and I did some collaborative stuff, and we essentially had 12, 14 chambers to work with.
And how long were you at Harvard?
I arrived there in the fall of '58 and left at the end of the spring semester in 1962, mainly because at that point Skinner decided he didn't want to worry about grants anymore, so he let his NSF grants lapse, and I was there at the end as a postdoc running the Pigeon Lab, so I had to look for another job. I couldn't get an academic job that year, and so I spent 2 years at Smith, Klein & French in Philadelphia doing psychopharmacology with Leonard Cook. That was a job that, there again, timing matters. Roger Kelleher had just left, making an opening, and so again, the people, I mean, Elliot Hurst left just in the nick of time. Lugala left just in the nick of time. Roger Kelleher left.
And you were right there.
And I was right there. I was right there. And I've just been incredibly lucky to be at the right place. So that was probably as good as it can get in opportunities.
What was it like being a behavior analyst in what really were pretty early years of the field?
Well, when I was an undergraduate, I was just taking psychology. I didn't know what psychology was, and I didn't know what its constraints were. And I can recall that when I finished the undergraduate major and then took my master's, which was the master's sequence was a 1-year sequence. You could do it in 1 year, and I did. That was the first time I was encountering people who were coming from other universities where they had different kinds of backgrounds. And I began to get a sense, hey, well, there are some people who don't think about psychology this way. At Harvard, it became a little bit clearer that there were differences because we knew about the George Miller leaving and the cognitive stuff beginning to develop. So there was a sense that things were changing, but still most of our time we spent with each other doing our stuff, and it just seemed so obvious that it made sense. We were working at a time in the field when everything seemed new. We had some new discoveries from the people who had just preceded us. We heard a lot about Bill Morse's work and Nate Azrin's work, and so they were all, and Don Blau, they were all recent PhDs. They weren't around there still, although we saw Bill Morse coming over from the medical school from time to time, and there were the Pigeon Lab meetings, so we were getting visitors. Peter Dews would join it. Jim Holland was around at that time, and he would join the Pigeon Lab meetings, B. Barrett. A lot of people from other places would turn up. But you didn't get a sense that you sort of knew it was a relatively small part of psychology as a whole, but it didn't seem like it was sort of an outcast, and yet it became clear as time went on that there were problems with the rest of the field. I mean, I did understand. I was a charter subscriber to JAAB, which the first volume came out in 1958, so I had certainly heard about it. And so there were the stories about that being stored up in part because it was hard to publish in the APA journals. And so I was beginning to get a feeling for that sort of separation between behavior analysts and others. But nobody worried about it very much. You just went and did your thing.
So the people who went to Columbia, behavior analysis was psychology. And then you went on to Harvard, and of course.
Well, it began to change very dramatically, and I understand it changed very soon after I left, because my understanding is that the dean then was Jacques Barzun, and Barzun, although he's regarded as a really, really important figure in literature and criticism, he apparently was offended by the assumptions about humanity that were represented by behavior analysis. And so he was actually made things very hard for the department. And essentially, I understand, got Nat Schoenfeld to leave the college to begin to teach in general studies. Fred Keller felt he was less welcome. And gradually, the department maintained some affiliation with behavior analysis. I mean, there were people there like Bill Cumming who came soon after. But the way the curriculum was organized began to change. And so even
it's amazing. It always happens that way.
Yeah, even by a few years later, it was pretty clear that there was going to be a very different department. Herb Terrace took his position there, but he was never quite mainstream behavior analysis. He did his few things on errorless learning, but he actually came out of a cognitive tradition. He was a student of Hochberg anyway, at Cornell, and so he never really, for reasons that are not clear to me, got involved in JAAB as an editor, or he certainly published there from time to time, but it was a different kind of orientation that didn't quite fit in with. So, for example, the errorless learning. Here he was, a guy who had essentially used a procedure that we now call fading, but he didn't really think of it as a procedure worth exploiting in that way. It was more the errorless learning part of it was what became important. So, my understanding, he just recently retired, and I haven't talked to him actually for a very long time. He later went on, of course, to do the stuff with the chimp named Chomsky, but that's a different story.
Well, I'd like to know what you consider the most important contributions that you've made to behavior analysis, or what you'd like to be remembered for.
Well, gee, okay, let me try. Well, first of all, a couple of other lucky things. In 1966, I got a phone call from, I think it was John Boren. I was in my lab, and by that time I was teaching at NYU, and I was putting up snap leads to wire up an experiment in the lab, and the phone rang, and John asked me if I wanted to have my name put up as the editor of JAAB. And I thought I must have misheard him. Associate editor maybe, but no, he was serious. Did I want to be the editor? I thought that was absolutely crazy. But, and it turned out that I didn't know it at the time, that there were about a half a dozen or more other people who already turned him down. So at least I was the editor. They had the good stuff. Anyway, I had an opportunity to really get to know the field in depth during those years. I was really lucky because actually Vic Lavies and I were running against each other. I mean, it was never against, but we were the two candidates. And I was really surprised when I was elected over Vic. I mean, I just thought there was just no way that would happen. And then Peter Dews made the suggestion that through all that time, Nate Azrin had been running everything. And Nate Azrin's title actually had been executive editor. He was doing all the manuscript handling and all the business stuff too. And Peter suggested that I should really talk to Vic about it because he knew Vic was interested in publishing. So I asked Vic if he wanted to be executive editor and worry about the business end of things, and because Vic liked the idea of publishing and all that, and I would then take care of the manuscript end. And Vic accepted, and that was the best decision I ever was involved in. I wouldn't have even thought of doing it if it hadn't been for Peter Dews' suggestion. But Vic has just been marvelous for the field in doing that. And I do feel that I was able to do a few things while I was JAAB editor. Usually as an editor, you can only select from what comes in, but we got the book review stuff going. So along those years, I managed to get a couple of Willard Day's paper on Skinner and Wittgenstein into JAAB. We got Kenneth McCorkadale to do a retrospective review when I discovered that he had actually written a reply to Chomsky that had never been published. I still have the letter of rejection from the journal Language that he got, which was this sort of off-the-cuff thing, like, oh, we hear this stuff in cocktail parties. It's really no longer timely, and they sat on it for a while besides. So there was that, and then I didn't know it at the time, but Keller and Schoenfeld absolutely consistent about always reinforcing responses, never reinforcing organisms. And I just was educated in that. It never even occurred to me that it was important. We used to argue about it when I was a graduate student. Dick Ernstein was involved in those arguments, and George Reynolds and others. And Skinner was pretty inconsistent. He would sometimes talk about reinforcing the person, and so here I had the opportunity to do something about it. So we consulted, and I talked to the associate editors and all. We decided to make it a journal policy. And so we actually instituted that. I think there were still lapses, by the way, but I think we were more rigid in those days. And we made the point that if somebody had a really consistent reason for doing otherwise, that if they could justify it and were consistent, they could do it, but otherwise they should adhere to the policy. And so we in fact did that. So that's a little bit of a contribution. I think it does make for clarity. You tend to be less ambiguous about what's going on if you say what the response is that you're targeting. Mostly people came around, and in fact once Vic Ladies got a manuscript from Skinner. It was the Shaping of Phylogenetic Behavior, which was going to be published as a Konorski memorial in a special issue of a Polish journal. And Skinner thought it would be nice if it was also published in parallel in JAAB. And Vic had sent me a letter saying, look, Charlie, Fred submitted this article and I think we ought to publish it, but he's talking about reinforcing the rat rather than reinforcing the response, and what should we do? So I got the thing, and Vic had some other stuff in his letter, and I responded to the various things, and I had a paragraph in which I said, well, Vic, I think you should say, by that time Vic was editor, I was no longer editor, you should say that we had this policy, and if he were to violate it, how could we ask anybody else to follow it? And I said, but maybe you want to be more specific, and it turned out there were only 2 or 3 offending sentences, so I took each one of them and I just reworded it to have the rat's response being reinforced. It was the rat was reinforced for climbing over the wall became the rat's climbing over the wall, or something. It was that kind of sentence. Well, apparently all Vic did was he made a copy of my paragraph and sent it to Skinner saying, this is what Charlie suggested. and he wrote back to say, sure, fine, no problem. And it got published that way with those changes. And Vic and I met him at a meeting maybe the following summer or something like that. And Vic asked him what he thought about it. He said, oh, no problem, have to keep up with the times. But he still did have trouble, because even when we later did the behavioral and brain sciences thing where many of his things were reprinted and he tried to fix them, he would occasionally lapse in a sentence. But he always did think it was once he started worrying about it was a good idea. That was only one of the things I did. You asked me to.
Yes, I'd like to hear some more.
You want me to keep going?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, actually, okay. I can think of 3 things with respect to writing and the JAAB or publication. JAAB is one of them. Having served in behavioral and brain science as an associate editor representing the experimental analysis of behavior, I was able to get started and work out with Steve Harnett, who was the editor of Behavioral and Brain Sciences, the special Skinner issue in which his papers got sent out to a bunch of commentators, mostly outside of behavior analysis, and then Fred wrote his responses to him. And actually, I probably had more interaction with him in the course of doing that than in a whole bunch of all of my time as a graduate student. And one piece of it was that Skinner didn't like to do abstracts. And Harnett insisted that every piece in that had to have an abstract. And these were the early days of word processing. So I'd take one of Skinner's articles, like, say, the operant analysis of problem solving, and I'd start going through it and typing key sentences, like lead sentences in the paragraph. And then I started rearranging them. And I finally ended up with an abstract that sounded like Skinner and sort of summarized what that particular article was about. And I sent them to him for his approval. And then we were in a phone conversation some way into it by the time I had done all the abstracts. And he said casually on the phone after we talked, he said, by the way, Charlie, I really liked your abstracts. To which I responded, well, Fred, they're your words. But so that was kind of fun. The third thing, I guess, is I think I've always liked words and liked issues of keeping the vocabulary consistent, and so in my learning book and and especially in the glossary of that, I've felt that I've been helpful in trying to organize our stuff so that the future people who come along in the field have some resource. Because when I first did the learning book, and it first came out, it was reviewed in Contemporary Psychology, which was the then book review journal of the American Psychological Association. And the person who reviewed it was a woman who was a cognitive psychologist. And she had a really nice set of things to say about the first part of the book, which dealt with schedules and stimulus control and all that kind of stuff. But then she said that the second part, in which I tried to integrate things in cognitive psychology and memory and so forth with the behavioral point of view, she said I was not successful at. Oh, and by the way, I would hope that anybody who looks at that would recognize that I'm totally indebted to Keller and Schoenfeld for having done that, because their textbook, Principles of Psychology, which is my first textbook, did exactly that. It took Skinner's stuff, and whereas behavior of organisms pretty much had references to just a few others, Pavlov and Keller and Schoenfeld took stuff from all over psychology and put it in there. And I tried to do the same kind of thing. And in fact, the way I think about it is if I see some experiment that's published somewhere, even from a different approach, one of the ways of thinking about it, where would that fit in one of these chapters? Could I get it in and work it in smoothly, show that it's an issue that's related to other things we already know about? But anyway, I subsequently met this particular reviewer at an APA meeting. And so I thought I went to talk to her, and I said I appreciated the review. But I was really kind of wondering what she meant when she said I didn't quite capture the cognitive part. Could she tell me what I could have done? And well, she went around a bit, and she finally said, well, really you need somebody who can talk to you well about that. Sam Ravusky's wife is somebody who knows through Sam something about behavior, but she also has a cognitive thing. And if you talk to her, maybe she can help you to figure it out. And I left feeling a little bit down and a little bit bothered. And then it suddenly occurred to me. Here I was an interested audience, asking her to tell me what cognitive psychology had to offer that I left out of my chapters. And she couldn't do it. If she can't do that with an audience like me, is she doing it with her students? I don't know. Whereas I can pretty much say what I want my students to know, and she couldn't tell me what she wanted her students to know. She couldn't tell me that. And I came away afterwards thinking, gee, maybe that's just as well. If they can't tell us what it is we're leaving out, maybe it's not anything we should worry about. So those three things. I can think of some experiments too, but
pick one.
Can I pick three?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. One set of experiments was one that came out of when I was a graduate student. We had colloquia, people coming through from all over Heartline, talking about the visual system of in the eye of Limulus, the horseshoe crab. George von Bekeshi was in the psych department before he won his Nobel Prize, talking about touch. And there's all this stuff about edge detection in physiological systems, in which if you have a sharp boundary, say between a bright and a dark area, then it turns out the way the nervous system works, the cells that are right at the boundary, the cells being stimulated by light fire at a higher rate if they're close to the boundary than further away, so you get a certain accentuation. Those cells work on the basis of reciprocal inhibition. Each cell in its activity reduces the neighboring ones. I was playing around with concurrent schedules, and there was all this stuff about behavioral contrast. And behavioral contrast was talked about as an excitatory thing. And then Skinner had written criticisms of inhibition as a concept for what happens in extinction. And I thought I would try to turn things around and instead talk about reinforcement of one response inhibiting other responses. And so I was actually able to do one experiment in which we had a continuum of stimuli. You reinforced the ones, well, actually it was vertical. Top 8 lights, when any one of those came on, responding was reinforced. The bottom 8 was extinction. And in fact, the behavior you got there was a similar kind of function. And the only person who really has appreciated that experiment is Don Blau. He's sometimes referred to it. But it turns out all of the work with concurrent schedules is variations on that different way of thinking about it. And I was even so outrageous as to entitle one paper, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, right? And one of Skinner's earliest papers was the concept of the reflex and the description of behavior. So I wrote a paper which it turned out I had a great deal of trouble publishing, which is called The Concept of Inhibition in the Analysis of Behavior. And I actually gave a copy of it to Skinner, and so, and it was also contradicting the notion that that inhibition should be part of the vocabulary. But I was switching around the vocabulary. But I like that. As the other experiments that I think I'm most proud of, one which I did in collaboration with Elliot Chimoff and Bud Matthews, who are my colleagues at NYU, I'm sorry, at UMBC, was the one on verbal governance, in which we shaped the verbal behavior of a human UMBC undergraduates working on a task, and we found that they were insensitive to the schedules. But if you shape their verbal behavior so as to get them to say, the way I earn points by pressing this button is to press it fast, and the way I earn points by pressing this button is to press it slow, lo and behold, that changed their rates of pressing. And so having, of course, all of this followed from Skinner's writings on what he called rule governance, which I think we should call verbal governance, not to get into trouble with other fields because they misunderstand it. But I think that says something about verbal behavior that I think is important. And then the third batch of stuff that I'm really pleased with is that when I was a graduate student, we were really into the questions about the effects of schedules of reinforcement. And one of the things was, well, why does you get high rates with ratios and low moderate rates with intervals? And Doug Anger had his inter-response time reinforcement model. But you know, it's hard to do DRL, and if you can't shape inter-response times directly in a DRL schedule, differential reinforcement at low rate, how could that be working in schedules when you know within 20 minutes or a half an hour a pitch and switch from interval to ratio will speed up? And for years and years and years I've been worrying about that, and eventually I was also involved with my colleague Elliot Chimoff in our Pigeon Lab at UMBC in experiments on delay reinforcement, and finally we were collecting data on the delay gradient itself, and we were finding ways to directly measure it. And because Elliot had been doing some computer simulations with me, and we were using those in teaching, he had developed a thing in which would generate cumulative records, and I was able to take that to generate the cumulative records and to take the delay reinforcement gradients and put together this model that recently is a simulation that came out, in which it's a simulated pigeon, yeah, and I still worry a little about simulations, but in which you can show without any assumptions about inter-response times that I think we've solved that problem. And you can show why the rates go up. It all has to do with how differential, it all has to do with being willing to see that if you have the reinforcer following a string of responses, that reinforcer doesn't just work on the last response, but on the one before it and the one before it. And once you play out how that works, you can see how the ratio and interval difference must emerge. And the really interesting thing about it is it couldn't have been demonstrated without computers, without a simulation. Couldn't have solved it, but we could have solved it in the early days of computers. And so it still amazes me that we now, all of the pieces that went into it, we'd actually known 20 years ago. So I'm kind of pleased with having wrapped up that problem. It took, what, from the 60s to, it took 40 years. And it's all about why pigeons go faster when you give them more payoffs, which when you tell the average person what you study, that's kind of funny. You know, what are you studying? Oh, well, when the pigeon gets more food for pecking, it pecks more often. Oh, duh. Yeah, but it's really neat to see it all fit together, especially, and now we've got possible implications for interpreting ADHD and for people use schedules in pharmacology and all that. So
Are you working with Terry Sagbolden?
yeah, in fact, Terry will be visiting the United States. He'll be at ABBA for the first time in many years in this upcoming meeting. Yeah, and so, in fact, Terry was the one who first saw the connection with ADHD. When he first said, I think what there is about ADHD, he was working with rats. I think maybe they've got a defective delay gradient, and he wanted to pursue that. And he said he thinks these rats are a model for ADHD. I told him he was crazy. Terry, what do you do that for? But he was stubborn, and he stuck with it, and he persuaded me, and so we've done some stuff since. And I think it's another one of those things where he had come to work at UMBC for a sabbatical in '74. And we've been in touch, and little by little this stuff built up. So, again, I've also been lucky with my the international contacts that have come out of this. My involvement with behavior analysis. So, yeah.
How do you think that behavior analysis has changed over the years of your career?
Well, the one thing I think it's easiest for me to say is that when we were students and we talked about it, we just knew there had to be applications. This was going to pay off. But Art Lindsley was doing a little bit of his stuff in the Psychiatric Institute, and there was a little bit here and there. We had the beginnings of a few people talking about applications. JAAB came not too long after, during my term as JAAB editor, in fact, that Nate Azrin came up with the proposal, and soon Mark Wolf and Todd Risley and the others began putting together that journal. But it was still not a big scale kind of thing. There are a few people here and there doing things. Now, if I meet people who are not in psychology and they say, what do you do? And I say, well, I teach in the psychology of learning, and actually I call my field behavior analysis, and I'm involved in a program where our students work over at Kennedy Krieger, and they work with kids with autism, and everybody says, oh, of course, and people know about that now. And so I think the most important thing is that what we're doing, I no longer have to say, well, this was all theory. When I was a student, we had the hopes that it would work, and now we're seeing that those dreams we had then are really happening. And yes, there's all sorts of stuff going on. I think our biggest contributions to education are still to come, and I think we have to do that. What is it, H.G. Wells, I think, said, human civilization is a race between education and catastrophe, or something like that. Right? And so when I see the promise of programs in which kids will learn to read without having to depend upon learning in the school system, in which we can really show the people in education seem to think that the problem is all in the curriculum. They worry about math, so they switch from this kind of teaching of math to that kind of teaching of math. So they're always changing the subject matter. But they're not talking about what teaching is. Fred Keller knew that. I think he would have been disappointed if he were alive now. And as I mentioned, I've just finished the editing of his autobiography, a big hunk of which is the Keller system, and the title of which is, I think is At My Own Pace. Well, it was paced instruction. It was, and in it he talks about his career having primarily been about teaching, whether it's Morse code or whatever. And I think we've got to break that boundary. If it's still the case that, to me, when I was flying here on the plane, I was sitting just a little bit across from two teachers who were talking about teaching. And I was tempted to interrupt them and say, wait a minute, that's not what you should be talking about. You're not talking about what the student does, you're talking about what you do in front of them. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's still a big challenge. I think we know an awful lot, but getting into the systems to make it work is a big challenge. Do you think the
best strategy is to try to get in as early as possible in the system, or what?
I wish I knew. I think if the Head Sprout folks are successful in teaching lots of kids to read before they even hit the schools, that's got to have some impact. It's got to make a lot of parents realize that they don't need the schools to teach some of these things. I mean, after all, Fred Keller's Goodbye Teacher is about the kid patting the teaching machine on the way out of the class. And there are functions for teachers, but it's only with things like that that we can deal with the numbers. I mean, class sizes keep on growing. And one of my terrific advantages was that when I was a student, we had 8, 10, 12, even the intro course was maybe 30 or 40 of us in the lecture, as I remember. Maybe I'm off by a factor of something or other, but certainly it was not the numbers students have today in classrooms. And so more and more, I do it myself. I can't point fingers at anybody else, because if I have a class of 140 students, I can do things like give online quizzes and things to keep them working, but at least I'm always thinking that what I've got to do is make them behave. Even if I've got to use these rotten contingencies like giving exams, it's all directed not at formulating the material so it's easier for them to absorb, but rather getting them to do it. And so I guess I'm not talking so much about how the field is different, but what our objectives are. I'm sure there are all kinds of interesting experimental things that are still to be done. There are things that we used to spend a lot of time studying that sometimes are not talked about as much. Talking to Jim Holland about observing behavior and things related to that we still have a lot to learn about. So,
is there anything in your career you would do differently if you had it to do over?
Oh my, that's hard to say. I mean, not with respect to, well, I wish I'd had different kinds of resource for doing different sorts of research. And I can think of things about my academic career, so that there were some difficult political times at my university, UMBC, in my early days. And it was a relatively new campus at that time, and there was even talk about whether the campus should stay open or not in the state of Maryland. And so I can remember in those early days wondering whether I made the wrong decision in that move. I mean, there were other moves I might have had an opportunity to make. But then again, if I hadn't gone there, I wouldn't have collaborated with Elliot Shimoff. Elliot was also a Nat Schoenfeld student at the he was in the graduate program. He started in psychophysics and was going to be going to Columbia as a graduate student to work with Clarence Graham doing psychophysical stuff. And two things happened. One is he read Murray Sidman's Tactics of Scientific Research, which somebody lent it to him. And he thought, gee, that's kind of interesting. I like that kind of science. And then he met Nat Schoenfeld and started talking to Nat. And by the time he had been a graduate student for a little bit, he suddenly was doing behavior analysis. So when we met, he was also doing some, Byron Matthews was the third person there. He was a behavioral sociologist. And he and Elliot were doing human operant stuff with relay racks equipment. And so I ended up joining them in their lab, and I don't know that I would have done any of the human operant stuff if it wasn't for that. So, should I say would I have done something else? Would I have had a different kind of career if I went somewhere else? Well, would that have been better than having had that collaborative experience? We can't, we don't know. You never know. I think overall, I think I've just been pretty lucky in having the opportunities I've had.
What areas would you like to see more work being done in our field?
Well, more in verbal behavior, absolutely no question about that. More on education. And we did try to incorporate some things. We did occasionally do studies in which we collected data in our classes. The nice thing about that is you can be exempt from going through IRBs if you're doing it as part of your usual class routine. So that was it. There are some specific topics. I wrote a little piece for the 50th anniversary of JAAB, and one of the things I noticed in looking at the JAAB back then and JAAB now is that most of the stuff that was represented then is still represented, but the one thing that's missing is we tend to be steering away from research on aversive control. Well, much as you might say it's unpleasant to talk about and we shouldn't be doing things involving aversive events, it's enough a part of the world. All you have to look at is the way people around the world deal with each other. It's aversives all over the place. And and there's still a whole bunch of questions about aversives that we don't know. I mentioned one puzzle, for example, is that we know that observing behavior is maintained by reinforcers. But then again, you do make the phone call to get a diagnosis, which might be pretty bad news. And so, for example, we don't even know whether observing responses would be maintained if the stimulus to be observed is one that's either correlated with an avoidable aversive event as opposed to an inevitable aversive event. And I suspect that we could show that was maintained. If you can do something about it, you'll look at the stimuli. There are virtually no data out there. But yet you've got to go through an IRB, you've got to worry, you've got to convince people who are not behavior analysts that it's important to know about this stuff. And we're still a young field. I think we've got plenty to learn.
Yeah.
We've got things to learn about how reinforcement works, and although we tend to back off from it sometimes, we need to learn more about the physiology of it, especially since the people who are talking about the brain nowadays are taking these things like PET scans and CAT scans or whatever kinds of scans and talking about this part of the brain lights up as if this is here and that's there in the brain. But the brain is an organ that has evolved in the service of behavior. Evolution is about organisms who behave differently. And the ones who behave in certain ways are the ones who survive. So their muscles, their bones, and their nervous system is all involved in the service of the behavior, the sensory stuff. And so you can even think of the brain as an organ that has evolved to accommodate itself to the environments in which it finds itself. Well, if that's the case, then looking at behavior as something that drives brain structure is something that tends to be neglected by the people. So I've just been involved in a thing with behavioral brain science. The commentary involves linguists who are talking about the brain driving language, but without an adequate attention to the possibility that the environment, the verbal environment, is driving the brain organization. And that would really turn upside down a lot of the ways that linguists think, especially given I think we're finally getting ready to respond to the Chomsky stuff, and that I could. Chomsky's challenge was a little bit like the challenge to Darwin. That is, in Darwin's account, there was this long period of time at the end of the 19th century when the biologist was saying, well, look, the only genetics we know is Mendelian genetics, and it doesn't provide any source for the variability. And without variability, Darwinism doesn't work. And so actually Darwinism went through a decline, and after Darwin died, it was kind of in limbo. And it wasn't until the 20s and the biologists began studying the mutations that they solved the problem of the origins of novelty. Now, what was Chomsky's criticism of Skinner? Skinner can't talk about how the child can generate a novel sentence. Well, we're getting to come now to have all sorts of ways of talking about the origins of novel behavior with Murray's equivalence classes, and shaping is another way. And so now we've got a lot of ways of talking about that. So I think, and with some of the things we now know, I think we're in a much better position to turn that around finally and put that behind us. Because once we do that, get Chomsky out of the picture.
What do you see?
We're outliving him, that's for sure.
Yeah.
We will,
Some of
as
us
a
anyway.
field.
What do you see as the future of behavior analysis? What do you project into the future? We're talking about we are making some steps forward that we have been needed for a long time, but project out for 20 or 30 years and what do you see?
20 or 30 years. That's hard. That sort of depends upon the culture that we're in and whether we don't have some real catastrophes. And the following from global warming and other kinds of, and war, and but assuming that we do get by that, I mean, if we make progress, and most of the other sciences have in the long run, they've finally gotten past controversial issues. There was a time when in biology there were fights over the priority of anatomy or physiology, form or function. And biologists finally resolved that. We haven't resolved it because, in fact, a lot of the alternatives are, in fact, about form rather than function, and we have the handle on function. So I think as that becomes more widely accepted, if you watch the news, occasionally you'll find even politicians you might not like, saying, "Hey, behavior should have consequences." That's remarkable.
It is.
So I don't know whether it's going to happen, but I think Joe Brady's been talking about, I guess it was Galambos or somebody had a figure once in which showed the growth in human knowledge and how it all really started to.
Buckminster Fuller.
Yeah, Buckminster Fuller and some others. And, well, if that's going to happen in general, it might also happen for our field. And wouldn't that be nice for our culture to begin to see that the what we can do really does mean you have to pay attention to its origins. Other parts of the world have accommodated to Darwin a little better than this country has, actually. So from the European point of view, Darwin is not as controversial, and so maybe we will move in that direction.
What message would you like to see? Would you like to send to students of the future? What do you want to tell them? And just you can take as much time as you want on this, but tell us how you would like to run the world as to make behavior analysis happen if you could do it. What do you want them to do?
Well, I think I'd ask them to read very carefully a paper that Skinner once wrote called "A Flight from the Laboratory," and what he did was described other kinds of behaviors, some of which provides much more immediate consequences. Playing around with mathematical models. You do the model. Actually, when I did that computer simulation, the neat thing is that I could run in a few seconds a simulated session, whereas if I did it with a real pigeon, I'd have to wait out the full hour. Other things, the flight to real people, and so the flight to the inner person. And I think those are still out there. They're the students who mainly get into behavior analysis because they've worked in a certain setting and they really like the social interactions that come, as well as the fact that they can see progress, and that's great. I mean, you don't want to eliminate those other reinforcers; they're important. And we've got to have people doing the delivery of the service and all. But I would ask them to pay attention to the basics, because all of those skills that are involved in particular applications are based upon certain general things that we know. And unfortunately, departments are getting rid of their animal labs, so that the whole department now, the only way for the students I see at UMBC, the way they learn about shaping is actually to go to Kennedy Krieger and to work with some kid on the unit someplace. And I don't think that we're going to be in a position to recreate rat labs, and maybe it isn't even necessary to do that, although I hope that there are some places that maintain it. But I hope that they will recognize that this is an organized subject matter, and that you have to know about the basics, that you can't just jump in and say, well, I'm interested in this application, so I'm not going to learn everything there is for behavior analysis as applied to X, applied to autism, applied to organizational behavior, whatever, you pick it. But I would hope that always there is this looking at the fundamentals, including for human behavior, verbal behavior, because when you really push it far enough, this subject matter bears on life. I mean, you can see it in everyday situations. My students who, this semester I'm teaching a seminar in verbal behavior, and my students are telling me that now they hear conversations at home, and suddenly they respond to those differently than they used to. And it really does make a difference. It makes a difference in lots of places. So only if you really get into the basics, as well as the stuff that can follow from it, I think, are you most likely to make applications. And then there are these sneaky ways of in which this stuff gets into the culture, surprising ways. Karen Pryor's clicker training. The New York Times book review did a review of this book on Shamu, in which I forgot the name of the author right now, but She's another person who works with animal training and who is now talking about how this stuff can be applied to your personal interactions. Some people are very angrily reacting to that, saying, "Oh, you can be treating people like animals." And you've got all the people who misunderstand reinforcement and think it's the same as bribes, which
it's still often mentioned. Yeah.
And what they don't understand that if you arrange a discriminative stimulus that says if you do this, then I will do that, but that's nothing like what reinforcement is about. In fact, it's a really bad practice. But anyway, there are all those things that are creeping into what people are learning about through these things like interacting with their pets, and so forth. And you start thinking about it. It's happening here. It's happening there in our culture. Happening there. It's got to be adding up.
I think so too. You hear the word behavior so often, just on the radio and in everyday conversation, when people never used to talk about behavior. They never said the word behavior, unless it meant behave yourself, sort of thing.
Yeah. So I'm hopeful.
Great. Thank you very much.
I think we better be. Well, thank you. It's been great to be here. Thank you for
Glad to have you.